Hello, I'm Nancy Dale Conroy. I'm the author of From Derry to the Pontiac, and this particular presentation is going to cover the years 1821 to 1827. It's chapter 6 in my book, and it is an important period in the early settlement of Clarendon. And so I will take you through the story. John Dale Sr., my great-great-great-grandfather, and Thomas Hodgins were the two men involved, and you'll hear their story as we go along. When I gave the presentation, I asked these questions at the beginning. I was a bit curious to see if people locally or who were attending knew much about the early history of Clarendon. So the first question was, did they know who the earliest settlers were, and where did they settle in Clarendon? I was a bit surprised that no one seemed to really know. Perhaps the right people weren't in the room. But there were a number of early settlers. There was a Radford, a Cody, a McCaig, a Mamure, an Armstrong. These men chose to settle close to the river. They didn't seem to want to come inland. And so when John Dale and Sr. and Thomas Hodgins arrived in Heath Bay, they would have found there were some settlers along the river, but they chose to go inland, about 6 miles. And certainly one of the questions I had, and I asked the group, why would these two men, these two settlers, why would they choose to trek into the center of Clarendon? It was basically wilderness, a lot of bush. I asked the group, and they had a few theories. The main theory, and I've seen this written up in other documents, is that when they got about 6 miles inland, just up the ridge below Shawville, above Shawville, they discovered there were fresh springs. And clearly, if you were a settler at the time, you really wanted access to fresh water, and that may have been one of the reasons they stopped there. I also think that John Dale Sr. and Thomas might have met working in the lumber camp when they were both based in Carleton County, and they would have worked on the Quio in the camps, and perhaps found out that in the inner part of Clarendon, away from the river, there were really good stands of pine. This would have been important for them to know, both in terms of building shanties or log cabins, but also in terms of being able to sell some of the timber that they might have cut down. I also wondered whether or not they had some sense that as the land rose from the river, perhaps the land where they stopped was a good area for soil. Now, it's hard to know whether they really were able to tell that because there was a lot of bush, but one of my thoughts is that that might have been an area where they felt the land was perhaps good for farming. The last theory I had is they might have just gotten tired of hacking through the bush. Must have taken a lot of hard work with a couple of simple axes in order for them to really get into the center. The other question I had for them, wondered if they knew where the early settlers were from. There tends to be a bit of a myth that Shawville was settled by the Tipperary Irish, and that's partly true, but you'll see as I go through the presentation that there were some other settlers that didn't come from Tipperary that I want to talk about. I thought I'd let you know, first of all, though, that when doing the research on this early settlement of Clarendon, I spent a lot of time at the Pontiac archives on the main street in Shawville, Quebec. If you or anyone you know is doing historical research, genealogical research on families that came relatively early to the Pontiac and to Clarendon, you have to visit the Pontiac archives. I spent 6 years coming up here very regularly from Ottawa. It's a treasure trove of information. There are old maps, there's family binders, there's family files, there's family boxes, there's all kinds of information about the town council meetings, there's minutes of meetings from about 1855 on, not so much from the early years, unfortunately. A lot of the records don't exist now, but this is a wonderful place to do research, and I spent a lot of time there. I certainly use the internet a great deal. As you know, 30 or 40 years ago, people doing this kind of research would have had to go to actual archives all over the place to try to track down information. Fortunately for me, I was able to use the internet. I have an account for Ancestry where I did a lot of census research and also family tree research. I did spend a little bit of time at National Library and Archives Canada here in Ottawa. One of the things I did come across there was something called trying to think of the fellow's name. It's a font that was put together by a local Catholic priest who did a wonderful job of collecting up as much information as he could about the early settlement of Shawville. I do note below that a lot of that material was written up by people I call local historians, people like W.A. Hodgins, Mrs. Hurst Hodgins, were born in the late 1800s, and they certainly had access to their parents or older relatives and older people living there. And they have written up all kinds of really interesting accounts of what those early years were like. So I certainly relied on their information as well. So I thought I'd touch a little bit on both John Dale Sr. and Thomas Hodgins, as they were the first two men who made this decision to come into what we call the center of Clarendon Township. Now, John was born in roughly 1777 in County Derry in Ulster in the north of Ireland, whereas Thomas was about 10 years younger. He came from the south part of Ireland, Tipperary in particular. In the case of the Dales, I did a lot of research to figure out why they might have come up the Ottawa River and perhaps first visiting Goulburn in Carleton County. We do know for a fact that Thomas Hodgins was in Carleton County as of 1819. There's a record of the ship he came on. The Dales were not on that ship. They wouldn't have met on that ship. Some people suggest that's where they perhaps met. He had relatives in Carleton County, and that was a reason for him to actually come to settle, whereas John Dale Sr. didn't seem to have a connection to the county. And I did actually check extensively to see if there were any Dales anywhere in that area, and I couldn't find any. In John Dale Sr.'s case, he was what we call an Ulster Scot. His Dale family had settled in Ulster in the north of Ireland very early, probably in the 1700s. There are, in fact, some early census documents that indicate there were Dales there in those during those 2 centuries. In Thomas Hodgins' case, he would be what we call a Tipperary man. I've already talked about where he came from. John Dale's wife, Elizabeth Wilson, I wanted to note that she, in fact, was older than her husband, and when she arrived, he would have been about 44, and she was closer to 50, so not a young woman, and in fact, at the time, average age of mortality would have been around 45, so they were an older couple. In Thomas's case, 10 years younger than John, and he had a younger wife. Now, in John's case, he had 2 sons, John Jr. and William. He was also accompanied up to Clarendon with a relative by the name of Edward. We don't know for sure how Edward was related. He might have been a nephew or a cousin, but we do know from DNA that he was, in fact, part of the Dale family. In Thomas's case, a couple of his children were born in Ireland. At least one was born in Carleton County, because when he came up to Clarendon, he left his wife, Hetty Pye. He left her down with family, probably in Carleton County. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about the early settlers at the center of Clarendon. These are the settlers who came early. I'll talk a little bit later about where I gathered this information from. So you had a number of families who came from Ulster. There were 4 Dale men, there were 3 McDowell men, a couple of Armstrong men, and a Brownlee who chose to settle fairly close to the center. You then had a fairly good group that came from Tipperary, including Thomas Hodgins. There was a Hobbs, a Dagg, Somerville, and a Wilson. There were a number of men, though, also that came to the centre from the rest of Ireland, an O'Neill, a McVeigh, and a Sparling. And there were also a number of men who came from Scotland directly to the Canadas, and they were Hamilton, Gibson, Paul, and Wilson. I've got 4 names in orange, and the reason I did that is because prior to doing my research on the Dale family, I knew that I was connected to them, but I had no idea that I had ancestors, direct ancestors, who were some of the other early settlers, including the McDowells, the Armstrongs, and the Hamiltons. And it was wonderful to find out that I'm actually related to a number of these very early settlers. Now here's a modern map of Clarendon. I thought I would include it just to point out a few things. I'll talk about James Prendergast in a minute, but this I think is roughly where John and Thomas arrived. Heath Bay is roughly here. They moved almost due north. I don't know if they had a compass or not, but they ended up, John about here where he squatted, Thomas a little bit over to the left, somewhere over here. So as the settlers arrived, they were all essentially squatters, and it wasn't until 1826 that a survey began of this township of Clarendon. The boundaries had been set, but not the farm lots. So initially there was a surveyor from Quebec City, Benjamin Equier. He started the farm survey in 1826. But after that, James Prendergast was appointed as not only the person to carry out the survey, but the land agent for the area who was going to then be allocating the farm lots. James Prendergast had fought in the War of 1812. In fact, he was a hero in the War of 1812, and for that reason, he was both granted a big chunk of land, which he basically took about here. He settled at the river. I believe it was Range 1, Lot 8 and 9, and Range 2, Lots 8 and 9. So he had quite a good allocation, not as much as he wanted, but certainly a good chunk of land was allocated to him because of his service during the war. So he started the survey in the spring of 1826. Interestingly, Thomas Hodgins was hired by him to help with the survey. So Thomas acquired a pretty deep knowledge of all of the township in terms of what the landscape was like, where the creeks were, where the lakes were, etc. And he would have worked on that survey with James Prendergast for a couple of years. I should point out too that the first document really in terms of this 1821 to 1827 period that I found was a copy that's included in the book Clarendon and Shawville by Lloyd Armstrong, and it reports on the 1826 details, but also on the 1827 details, which are a bit include a bit more of the information about allocation of the lots. Sadly, James Prendergast died in 1834. He was a pretty young man. He'd gone to Quebec City, contracted a disease there, and died. And so he really was only present in the area from about 1826 to about 1834, although his family continued to live in the area. I thought I would touch a little bit on what it was like as of 1827 at the center of Clarendon. This doesn't include all of the settlers because some of them stayed closer to the river, some of them perhaps moved quite a bit further north or further west. But you can see there were a cluster of people who decided to squat really in the vicinity of Lot 5, Range 6, Lot 6 and Range 7, fairly close to where John Dale and Thomas had settled. So at this time in 1827, there were roughly 38 settlers, and I took this from information that was in Lloyd Armstrong's book. But there were 25 of them were here on these three ranges, 5, 6, and 7. Now, many of you might know that James Prendergast was determined that he would only allocate land to Protestants. I point out in my book that prior to his arrival, of all the settlers who came before he arrived, almost all of them were, in fact, all of them, as far as I know, were basically Protestant. So I think the village at the center that emerged over time probably would have been Protestant regardless, because a lot of these settlers brought over family members to join them. But certainly it's the case that he was concerned about not having Catholics in the township for fear of a lot of strife and perhaps fighting between the Protestants and the Catholics. Something else I noticed when I was examining his report is that to some extent the allocation process was a bit fluid. Even though those who were going to be granted land had to have built a shanty, they had to have cleared a number of acres, they had to have begun the building of a road at the front of their property. However, for example, William Hodgins wasn't there during this period. He didn't arrive till 1831. He happened to be a brother of Thomas Hodgins, so I suspect that Thomas Hodgins, because he'd been on the survey with Prendergast, perhaps suggested that a lot be set aside for his brother, whom he hoped might join him. And as it turned out, William did, as did a number of his other brothers. The other thing I noticed were there were a number of men, for example, in the McDowell family. There were quite a few young adults, teenagers who were members of the family, young men. And some of them weren't very old, 15, 16, 17 perhaps years old. Each of them were given allocations, and as a result, the McDowell family had a fairly strong presence in the area. And age perhaps didn't seem to be a barrier to being given an allocation. Third point to make is that there seemed to be a fair bit of switching around of lots, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Certainly did involve the Dales. So here is the situation with respect to the Dales in terms of their allocations. I've already mentioned John Dale Sr. had settled at the top of the trek, the path that had been hacked out of the bush between he and Thomas. So he ended up on what was Lot 10, Range 6 to the west of where Shawville is now. I'm going to talk a bit about the acreage in a minute because I'm going to show you an excerpt from Lloyd Armstrong's book and explain that. John Dale Sr. initially was located on Lot 13, Range 5, so kind of below his father's lot and a bit to the west. But at some point he switched to lot 10, range 7, which was due north of his father's lot. Don't quite know why he did that. I think the land at lot 13, range 5 might have been a bit better, but he chose to move to a lot just north of his dad's. John Dale Sr.'s other son, William, initially settled next door to his father, just to the west, but at some point switched to a lot that was further west, lot 14, range 6. Again, not sure why he moved away from his dad's lot. Edward Dale Sr. initially settled on lot 15, range 6, but at some point switched lots with a Brownlee and moved to lot 8, range 4, where he continued to farm, and as did his family. So here's an example of the report that's included in Lloyd Armstrong's book. Now, I didn't go and research all of these individual pieces of information one by one. It would have been taken an awfully long time, so I've trusted that Lloyd's information was accurate. Maybe it all isn't, I don't know, but I've based my calculations and some of the numbers I'm going to talk about on his report. And again, as I said, for genealogists and people interested in the early history, this kind of document can be really important. You'll notice that it identifies the name of the person, the settler. It identifies the initial lot they were allocated, because in the beginning they were only allocated 100 acres. If they met various conditions, they could then seek title for 200 acres. And that may be one reason why the settlers early on spread out when they were squatting, to make sure that they would ultimately be eligible perhaps for 200. This identifies the date at which they received their ticket for the 100 acres each. And the other really interesting information is it also includes the head of the family, the wife, were there children. In the case of Martin Moore, he had children, males and females, and also were there single men living with them. So based on his report, I have put together this little profile on the left. My calculation is there were roughly about 100 individuals, including the men and their families. There were 38 men, 17 women. And of course, many of these men were actually single. 21 of them were single. So you had quite a lot of these single young men. Some of them came on their own as young men, and some of them were the sons of the early settlers. So for example, John Dale Jr. and William were the sons of John Dale Sr., and they were single. There were lots of children, some of whom had been born in Ireland, some of them perhaps born in Carleton County or other places in Lower or Upper Canada, and then some of them born during this period. The settlers ranged in age from babies up to probably the early 50s. For example, William McDowell Sr. was roughly the same age as John Dale Sr. His wife was about the same age as Elizabeth Wilson, who was John Dale Sr.'s wife. So you had settlers who were all ages. One thing I did find interesting, I didn't come across any reported deaths between 1821 and 1827. And the first death I came across that was reported was in 1831, and that was sadly Thomas Hodgen's wife. I believe she was in her early 40s, so it was quite sad that she died so early. Of all of these settlers, and by the way, I researched all of these settlers in terms of who they were, their families, where they'd come from, what religion they were, etc. I was very interested in knowing as much as I could about all of these neighbors of John Dale Sr. So most of these settlers were with the Church of England. In Ireland, they would have been with the Church of Ireland, but we're basically talking about Anglicans. A small number were Methodists, so that you had a group of people who came, for example, Francis Armstrong was a young single man who came with two of his brothers who were also single. I think he and one of his other brothers were Methodists, so you did have Methodists present. It appears that most of these men back in Ireland were farmers, but some had more experience. For example, there were two Brownlee men who came to Clarendon early. They are reported as weavers in the information that I was able to collect related to their service in the 100th Regiment of Foot. It identified them as weavers. Some had carpentry experience. For example, William Hamilton from Scotland had been a carpenter. There were some who'd had experience as innkeepers, and there were a few that had had experience as soldiers. So you did have some skill sets beyond just farming or farmers. Now, here are some facts coming back to John Dale Sr. and Thomas. I found it quite nice that these two men seem to have been called Daddy John or Daddy Dale and Daddy Tom. And no other settlers have I come across in the early records that were given these titles, this title of Daddy. And I thought it seemed to reflect a sign of respect. Perhaps they were considered to be the elders, the men who got there first. And so that was one thing I definitely noted, that this title was reserved for them. I think I've mentioned a few times, John was settled on Lot 10, Range 6. And beyond 1827, it became the site of the first school around 1832. We believe the school was used as an Orange Lodge from time to time, because many of these settlers would have been members of the Orange Order. Two churches, the early churches, were built on Lot 10, Range 6, a Methodist church and an Anglican church. And these were actually built on where we now know the Shawville Village Cemetery is, and I'm assuming that some of those early settlers who passed away were probably buried in a cemetery close to the churches. In the case of Thomas, he did settle on Lot 12, Range 5, but at some point he did acquire a part of Lot 11, Range 6. Both John Dale's lot and this lot became part of Shawville when it came into being. Something Thomas was very helpful doing early on was working with individuals who were disputing boundaries, and apparently that happened a lot back in the day. Perhaps it happens nowadays, I don't know for sure, but certainly back in that time he knew the township really well from being on the survey and provided this service. Don't know whether he charged for it or not, but certainly was a helpful member of the community. And in the case of both the Dales and the Hodgins, not only did these early settlers serve on the township council, but many of them, the descendants of these two men, also served on the Shawville Town Council when Shawville came into being in 1873. So towards the end of my presentation, I asked the group whether or not they thought that Thomas Hodgins and John Dale Sr. qualified as founders of Shawville. Having done 6 years of research, having spent a lot of time reading an awful lot of material, not only about them, but about the village Clarendon Center that gradually grew where Shawville is now, I came to the conclusion they definitely were the founders of the town. And when I asked the question, the majority of the people, probably a group of 20 or 30 people, agreed with me. And here are some of the reasons why I came to this conclusion. They really were the first two people there. And if you look at the definition of what is a founder, to be a founder, you have to be there at the beginning. You're the person who started something. And as far as I'm concerned, their choice of that spot led to other settlers arriving, squatting near them. And as a result, you had a small village that grew around that spot, Lot 10, Range 6, that ultimately became the town of Shawville. Also, as I've noted, a number of public institutions in those early years were built on John Dale's land, and certainly as time evolved, on some of the other lots where Shawville is now. I would note, too, I mentioned earlier that the Dales certainly served, were very civic-minded. John Dale Sr., John Dale Jr., and in this case, John Sr.'s grandson, John Dale III, was the first mayor of Shawville, and had to give up being the mayor of Clarendon Council in order to become the mayor of the Shawville Town Council. Again, the fact that they were called Daddy and no one else was suggests to me that local settlers thought of them as the founders of the town, and they were very instrumental overall in developing the village at the center. That's the end of my presentation about this period. I hope you found it informational and helpful to you if you're doing any research related to the area or some of these families. I thought I'd just mention that this is an image of my book. It's, as you can see, From Derry to the Pontiac, How the Dales Journeyed to the Canadas and Helped to Found the Village of Shawville, Quebec. I also have an author website, From Derry to the Pontiac. You'll see it there if you're interested in learning a bit more about the book and about myself. Again, thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. And I do have two other presentations that are now videoed if you want to check them out there on YouTube. Thanks very much.